So this symposium is moving through time and space, transformative intercultural experiences within, at, through museums, organized by Teresa Gimenez from University of Pennsylvania. And we have three presentations. So Teresa Gimenez, Monica Velasco Gonzalez from University of Pennsylvania on cultural learning as a process in the museum, a case study. And Tiballi from also University of Pennsylvania, Teaching and Learning in the Cultural Museum, Keys to Successful Collaborations, and Christelle Papacuet, Lee, Rutgers University, Bringing the Museum into an Early Childhood Dual Language Classroom. So please join me in welcoming our presenters.
Okay, so I'm going to try to speak a little closer to the mic. Can you hear me well? Okay. So, hi everybody. We're very happy to be here today, and we wanted to extend our thank you to the Circle conference organizers, because we actually met here 2 years ago, and the seeds for the symposium were planted right outside by the swimming pool after after the day of conferences. So, thank you very much for offering this conference and allowing for this conversation to happen today. So we're going to share with you some aspects of our practices, right? This is going to be a little practice-oriented, and what we do with, at, and through objects and museums. We have several areas of expertise that are represented in this symposium, but they're all synergized around the notion of intercultural dialogue through objects and museum artifacts. So Anne, who will be speaking first, is the Director of Academic Engagement at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Anthropology Ethnography. And she will bring in her expertise in archaeology and museum education to us language educators, applied linguists, and interculturalists. And she will be describing museum-based partnership opportunities and how these can lead to intercultural dialogue in multiple content areas. The next two presentations that you will hear today will highlight the practices of language educators and will illustrate intercultural teaching practices using museums and museum objects at the two very extremes of the pre-K to 16 language learning continuum. Teresa and Monica will be sharing their experiences in an undergraduate Spanish class at the university level. And I'll be talking about working with 4-year-olds in a dual language program with objects and at the museum, right? So you'll get the full spectrum of possibilities. And since we wanted to focus on the applied and the practical aspects of the work we do with objects, perhaps we wanted to share right away with you the theoretical framework that we're going to be using, and since we're sharing it despite our respective disciplinary orientations, so that we can focus most of our presentations on practice and data and actual conversations. So, of course, we draw on a range of disciplinary perspectives, from museum education to multiple literacies, and specifically artifactual literacies, intercultural studies, of course, and also sociocultural perspectives on language education. Just a few words about some of that. Sorry, I'm a little lost in my notes. So we take across our disciplines and educational context, museum, classrooms, we're all very intentional about creating spaces for intercultural dialogue. And so this orientation to interculturality builds an emerging body of research in museum education and applied linguistics. So there is one convergence here that we're exploring. In our talks and research projects, we view interculturality as emergent, discursive, in interaction, and the negotiation of symbolic meanings through interaction with others and with objects, of course. And in our respective professional circles, there is a lot of talk about implementation of an intercultural stance in teaching in our classrooms or museum classrooms. So how do we teach interculturally? And that's also, there are of course many answers to these questions, but we'll share with you what our answers are to this, and trying to move forward from a view of teaching culture through language, moving towards teaching interculturally with and through objects at the museum and in the classroom. And in this symposium on mobility, we are reaffirming the materiality of languages and cultures, and we're viewing objects, artifacts, and museums as portals, so an illustration of our portals, as Anne would say. So portals to mobility through space and time, but also to the conflation of time and space in museums. Portals to access plurilingual and multicultural storied selves and the stories of others. In this very interesting zone, in-between zone of contact that is quite messy sometimes, where intercultural dialogue can really unfold. And I also think that this whole process of working together across the discipline, this has brought us together to also identify how the kind of professional conversations we're having at conferences such as this one or this symposium also represent another portal across the disciplines, right? So here is, in this symposium, what teaching interculturally with, through objects at the museum could look like and feel like. And Anne is going to open with her talk, Teaching and Learning in the Cultural Museum, Keys to Successful Collaborations.
Good morning, everyone. I love this conference. I want to come back all the time. Archaeology conferences are held in convention centers in the middle of sad towns. So this is lovely. So as I said, as Christelle said too, I'm an archaeologist, and my own research focuses on the late prehistoric South America context, and the centrality of craft production, specifically the weaving of fine cloth, in the creation of distinct imperial identities in the Inca Empire. Okay. So it may sound like a far stretch to my role at the Penn Museum, where I work with faculty and students to include our collections in their classes, research, and social lives. But what both sides of my professional life showcase is the central role of objects in the way that I think about learning, about the past, about others, and about ourselves. And so I'm overjoyed to realize that the work that I do in the museum has applications to the enormous undertaking that you are all engaged in. A little bit about the Penn Museum. My role this morning is to presuppose that you are all convinced of the value of working with a museum, and to tell you the ways to make that collaboration successful. My examples come from my own work at the Penn Museum, which is part of the University of Pennsylvania. We are the largest academic museum in the United States. We have over 1 million objects and about 60,000 square feet of gallery space. We are explicitly a museum of archaeology and anthropology, which means that our collections come from everywhere except for Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. This makes it hard to attract contemporary art classes, but it does give us an enormous opportunity to work with area studies, history, and in particular foreign language classes. It's advancing on its own. It's okay. My role at the Penn Museum is to work with Penn faculty to integrate the collections into their classes and to develop novel curricular approaches to these objects, particularly for those classes that don't need a finely grained understanding of ancient Greek red-on-black pottery styles. What these classes do need, in most cases, is an opportunity to move outside of their traditional classroom setting and to be pushed to think about their subjects in new ways. In the museum, they are literally confronted with an object that is simultaneously deeply foreign and yet seductively recognizable. After all, we are all human, and we still surround ourselves with objects. This confrontation, this disruption of the way that students are conditioned to approach their studies, can be tremendously useful in getting them to develop new skills, practices, orientations, and attitudes. So I want to take a brief interlude to talk about my own orientation to objects and to give a very basic schematic for why I think that they can be instrumental in the intercultural communication. So in a traditional classroom setting, students learn about the past or about other cultures, about whatever their subject matter is, by passively absorbing the information related to them by their professor or by their textbook, old school. In archaeology, this direct download of information is supplemented through pictures and descriptions of objects, since artifacts are our primary point of access to past cultures. But when we shift this model to put objects and students at the center of the classroom setting, something wonderful happens. Instead of passive ingestion of knowledge, the students use the objects to activate their understanding of the past and to mediate between what they know and what they have yet to discover. This is because objects themselves mediated social relationships in the past. They were active participants in social relationships. Material culture is not, as had long been thought, the residue of past culture, but was fundamental to it. So, what do we want? We want to create this moment of confrontation between students and objects, between students and other students, and between students and the people who communicate through time and across space through those objects. We want students to shift out of their brains and into their bodies to understand and experience the embodied nature of objects and spaces. We want them to be uncomfortable with what they see, feel, and discover, and to work to find a resolution to that discomfort, or to just get used to the idea of being uncomfortable. We want them to be disrupted, because that's how they learn. So coming back down from the hypothetical to the concrete, which is my favorite place to be, I want to talk about some examples from my own work of ways that we have enacted these principles in our teaching at the museum. First and foremost, I work with university classes and support professors in doing their own teaching with museum objects, galleries, and laboratories. In this picture, on the left, some students are in a course on ancient food, are chewing corn and spitting it into beakers in order to ferment it into chicha beer. And you can see from the looks on their faces that they are really into it. This course was taught as part of our archaeological laboratory program, which has hands-on or mouth-on approach to every part of its teaching. And on the right, some introductory students worked with obsidian and knapped their own stone tools, and then they're cutting into raw chicken carcasses in order to then examine the bones and look for butchery indicators under microscopes. Here, an upper-level class on the Anthropology of Museums looks at some of our objects from storage. Led by Professor Marge Bruchak, this class asks students to learn new methods for analyzing objects using the concepts of deep description and object reflexivity, which combines material analysis with ethnographic data, archival research, and critical scholarship to identify and document object histories. In addition to employing a myriad of archaeological and art historical techniques, students were encouraged to, quote, reflect on the makers of these objects and the memories of the communities they came from, to enter into a relationship with these people, past and present, who had a stake in these objects. Their preparation is rigorous, but they are asked to let their own ideas about what the objects do be informed by and find a balance with the interpretation of others. So we welcome about 5,000 students a year to the classrooms and galleries at the museum, and I could really talk about this all day, but I want to tell you about a couple of other programs that are informed by the principles of object-based learning and intercultural communication. So, not me, but my colleague in the K-12 program, their numbers put ours to shame, though I would like to point out that our students are larger, and therefore we're about equal by mass. Over 45,000 school children come through the museum each year, and many of them are coming through a special program with the city of Philadelphia called Unpacking the Past. And these are kids who would not be going on any field trips if it weren't for this program. Not only do they get a day off away from their regular classes, but they come to the museum and have a wonderful experience learning about ancient Egypt or Rome. The survey results from this program are overwhelmingly positive and specifically point to the active, inquiry-based, object-centered model of teaching. Students who have never spoken up before in class open up and engage with objects, and in doing so engage with their teachers, their fellow classmates, and the subject material like never before. And they develop a thirst for learning about other cultures. They want to come back, they want to read, they want to learn. Another program that just got started this past week is called Global Guides, which trains people from the regions represented in the museum galleries to give tours that incorporate their own personal narratives and insights. We will eventually have Global Guides for 3 galleries, and that starts with the opening of the Middle East galleries this April. So this is our first cohort. Kevin from New Jersey is the leader, our docent manager. Our final program is likewise very new, a collaboration with the Residency Program at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. Now, programs that bring doctors and medical students into art galleries for exercises and observation skills are not new, but we weren't able to reproduce those kinds of programs with the collections that we have. But what we could do is use the very foreignness of our collections to help medical residents become aware of their own implicit biases, which would then make them better able to treat their patients. So part of this workshop, they start out by taking the Harvard implicit association test. And then after that, the residents come to the museum for 3-hour intensive object study and discussion. We lead them to 3 objects in the galleries, encouraging them to observe details about the object and make inferences based on those observations, just like they do with their patients. We prompted them with questions that asked them to imagine the lives of the people who made and used these objects and how the object itself came to be at the museum. In some cases, as with this Elk Tooth Dress, which belonged to a girl from the Crow Nation in 19th century Montana, they become very moved by the stories that they can create and listen to. So the numerous elk canine teeth that cover the dress demonstrate the hunting prowess of this girl's family and the wealth of her people. The dress was probably taken from her when she was sent to an Indian boarding school and replaced with European clothing, and the dress was then sold to a dealer before finally making its way into our collections. The residents who were initially puzzled by this garment, they spent a lot of time trying to figure out what those dangly things were, became deeply sympathetic to this story and found themselves imagining what it might have been like to be that little girl 140 years ago. They also recognized that without contextual information, they would have had drastically misinterpreted the life of the person who once owned this object, and concluded that while it was necessary to jump from observation to interpretation, it is important to understand the ways that your own biases lead you down particular paths. Now, each of these examples have at their heart the premise that these sorts of confrontations with objects have the power to dramatically affect the learning environment and can be used to increase specific learning goals related to intercultural communication and competence. I'm going to let my colleagues discuss the particulars of those pedagogical concerns, but I want to make one final appeal as a museum professional and a lover of objects that when you go home after this glorious, warm, collegial weekend, that you send an email to your friendly neighborhood museum person. I looked at the list of presenters and found that many of you come from institutions with wonderful museums and galleries. And I know that if you reach out to the directors or the museum educators at these places, they will respond enthusiastically. Academic museums all around the country and the world are developing models for student programming that work toward the same goals that you are, to create more informed, more engaged global citizens who have the practical skills and the subtle understandings of how to move within and between cultural settings. And if you don't have a museum or a cultural space on campus, consider recreating some of these settings with what you can. Ask students to bring in objects from their own lives, to make and to share food, to get their hands dirty. I think you will find it truly transformative. Thank you.